Welcome back to Noir Frame. And guys, every criminologist has an intellectual fantasy. Is there truly a perfect crime? One that defies every forensic science, every detective, every dog earned textbook? Well, one professor at a major American university didn't just muse about it, he assigned it. He turned it into a final exam. And then, according to investigators, he may have tried to execute it himself. Welcome to a case that blurs the line between the expert and the perpetrator and asks whether profound knowledge of the law's limits is a shield or merely a challenge to the people who wrote the textbooks. Our story begins in the seemingly tranquil life of Bradford King. King was a fascinating figure in his community. He wasn't some shadowy fringe academic. He was a former police officer. He knew the job, the smell of the precinct, the routine of a crime scene. This background lent an immense weight to his later role as a criminology lecturer at Western Michigan University. He had the credibility of boots on the ground experience, tempered by the theory of the classroom. By all accounts, he was a happy family man. He and his wife, Diane King, lived a comfortable, upwardly mobile life. Diane, in particular, was ascending rapidly, becoming a popular local TV host, a familiar, friendly face beaming into living rooms across the state. They had two children, moved into a large, beautiful country house, and generally embodied the American dream of success built on professional expertise. In the classroom, King's favorite exercise was the perfect crime scenario. His students, budding criminologists, eager to prove their cleverness, would craft elaborate plots. How do you dispose of the body? How do you confuse traceology? How do you defeat ballistics? King was essentially asking the next generation of law enforcement to find the weak spots in their own training. But this comfortable life began to fracture when Diane's rising fame attracted the wrong kind of attention. A stalker entered their lives, a sinister, escalating presence. It began with invasive phone calls, then dinner invitations, and eventually a terrifying intrusion. A broken window, a climb into the home, and a note left behind, chillingly composed of letters cut from newspaper headlines. You must have lunch with me. For Bradford King, the man who knew everything about crime, this was no longer an academic exercise. It was a terrifying, real-world threat to his family. The conflict had moved from the abstract world of theory to the concrete danger of his own home. King, the former cop, the security expert, was now trapped in a scenario he couldn't control, and this escalating threat set the stage for the devastating turning point we'll discuss next. Here's a chilling idea. What if details that should solve a crime are specifically designed to confuse the people analyzing them? When Diane King was found murdered, shot in front of her home, while her two young children sat nearby in the car, the crime scene itself looked like a textbook case of a planned execution by the obsessive admirer. But the forensics told a far more complex story. The murder of the TV host sent shockwaves through the community, drawing immediate and intense police involvement, including the FBI. The investigation quickly established that the killer was a sniper, firing from a neighboring stable. The evidence initially seemed straightforward. A 22 caliber shell casing was recovered, and the actual weapon, a rifle, was found nearby. But the perpetrator, it seemed, was an expert at evasion. A scent tracking dog was deployed, and its behavior was highly unusual. It tracked the scent away from the stable, made a complete circle back, and returned right to the king's own house. This suggested the killer hadn't fled, but had circled the area, perhaps watching the entire police response from within the gathering crowd of onlookers, remaining unidentified. It was a brazen, confident maneuver, worthy of King's perfect crime scenario. The key evidence, however, immediately created a forensic labyrinth. The bullets recovered from Diane's body were too deformed, too damaged for ballistics experts to convincingly match them to the rifle found near the stable. This is a critical roadblock in firearm analysis. When the unique microscopic grooves or rifling left by the gun barrel on a bullet are destroyed, the individual fingerprint of the weapon is lost. The case hit a massive stall. The police had a timeline, a location, a suspicious letter, and a planted weapon, but no definitive link to a killer. The investigation initially focused heavily on the stalker, the obvious narrative provided by the newspaper cutout nerd, and the earlier break-ins. This was the turning point in the narrative of the case. The moment the police believed they were chasing a crazed fan. But the FBI, 10 months into the stalled investigation, decided to re-examine the anonymous threat letter. They started to consider the possibility that the letter wasn't a genuine threat, but an elaborate piece of misdirection. Who would know how to fake the appearance of a random maniacal stalker? Who would know how to effectively scratch and deform bullets to defeat ballistics? And who would have the intimate knowledge of the victim's routine to execute a sniper shot with such called calculation? The question shifted from who is the maniac to who's the expert. And all signs began to point to the man who literally taught the course on undetectable murder. Let's consider the ultimate irony. Could the pursuit of the perfect crime be the fatal flaw that exposes the perpetrator? The eventual focus on Bradford King stemmed not from a biological trace or a definitive match, but from a psychological profile built on a circumstantial evidence. The very definition of the unsolvable crime he challenged his students to create. Investigators realized that the cut-out letter was designed to obscure handwriting, but the act of composing it suggested the killer was intimately familiar with the victim, someone whose regular handwriting might be recognizable to police and family. The key conflict now was between the public image of the grieving husband and the private life of Bradford King. It turned out the happy family man was a facade. King was reportedly cheating on his wife and frequently involving with his students. This provided a compelling motive to escape his marital commitments and capitalize on his wife's life insurance. The pieces of the perfect crime began to look suspiciously like a professor's lesson plan. Students recall King was never around when the stalker calls were happening, suggesting the calls might have been timed or faked. More damningly, a separate, more functional rifle, the actual weapon used to commit the murder, was eventually found hidden in the neighboring property, separate from the deliberately placed deformed rifle. The initial weapon found was a plant. Investigators also revisited the students' perfect crime proposals. It was revealed that one student's paper had detailed a strategy strikingly similar to King's to imitate a maniacal stalker, escape across a large body of water, or similar geographic feature like a river or a wide circuit, as the dog track showed, and then plan a secondary, easily discovered weapon at the crime scene to confuse the ballistic trail and point suspicion elsewhere. King's students had effectively become unwitting accomplices in designing his defense. Despite the case being built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, the lack of an alibi during the calls, the students' papers, the professional staging of the scene, and the compelling motive, the jury was convinced. Bradford King was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. He remains in prison to this day, steadfastly maintaining his innocence. The case of Bradford King offers a profound lesson to anyone who studies criminology. It proves that forensic science is not just about matching a DNA strand or a bullet groove. It is, perhaps more importantly, about identifying pattern. The pattern of behavior, the pattern of deceit, and the pattern of an overconfident mind attempting to outsmart a system it once helped to build. Even if the gun doesn't confess, the design of the crime itself might be the confession you need. So, the professor who challenged his students to convince of a crime that could only be solved by a confession, was he ultimately defeated by his own academic hubris, or was the circumstantial evidence a flawed foundation for justice? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And that's it for today. I'll see you on the next one. It was Noah Frame, and bye.